Pursuant to notice, the committee will now come to order. We are meeting today to consider materials containing confidential tax return information protected by Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code. Given the confidential nature of the subject matter, I now move that pursuant to Clause 2G1 of House Rule 11, the committee proceed to executive session.
Mr. Chairman, I object to the motion on the grounds that this has been a very troubling process leading up to today's secret proceedings. Members on both sides of the aisle were kept in the dark about these documents until, well, when we see them, and are expected to consider and vote on them without any time to digest them. This is a stark departure from past committee precedent and practices where we provided all members 24 hours in advance to review these documents. So I object to the motion.
As the gentleman knows, the motion is not debatable, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Lewis. Mr. Doggett. No. Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson. Yes. Mr. Doggett votes yes.
No, I vote no. He votes yes.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson. Yes. Mr. Thompson votes yes. Mr. Larson. Yes. Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind votes aye. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell votes yes. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez.
You're speaking to the microphone. I can't hear you.
What exactly is the vote that we are taking right now?
Go into executive session.
Oh, aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Dalbene. Ms. Dalbene votes aye. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee votes aye. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle votes aye. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer votes aye. Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans votes aye. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi. Mr. Swazi votes aye. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta votes aye. Ms. Murphy. Ms. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes aye. Mr. Brady.
No.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Nunez.
No.
Mr. Nunez votes no. Mr. Buchanan.
No.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
No.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Marchant. No. Mr. Marchant votes no. Mr. Reed.
No.
Mr. Reed votes no. Mr. Kelly. No. Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Holding. No. Mr. Holding votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri. No. Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert.
Mr. Chairman, will you entertain a parliamentary inquiry?
Pardon, I didn't hear the question.
Would you entertain a quick parliamentary inquiry?
I think we're in the midst of a vote.
And the question is on what is our personal liability that we're
We
actually
will talk
moving
about
towards
that after
voting
we
for?
move to executive session.
So I'm going to vote to move to executive session where I'm going to see something that I may carry a personal liability for.
You will be offered advice before we do any of that.
I vote no.
Mr. Schweikert votes no. Ms. Walorski. Ms. Walorski votes no. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood votes no. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Lewis votes yes.
Mr. Lewis votes yes. Mr. Higgins. Ms. Sewell. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman votes aye.
The clerk will call the roll.
22 yeas, 17 noes.
There being 22 ayes and 17 noes, the motion is agreed to. I ask that all members of the public, press, member office staff, and non-designated committee staff to leave the room so that we can proceed to executive session.
Mr. Chairman, I move to postpone this meeting to a date certain, specifically July 26, 2019, so members of both parties may have 24 hours advance notice of documents as past committee process and Republicans provided Democrats in the last executive session.
Mr. Chairman, I move the table.
Mr. Thompson, Mr. Brady,
Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson.